The lights in the music hall were brighter than the boy had ever seen before. He stepped onto the wide wooden stage, his small shoes making a faint sound that echoed through the quiet hall. Rows of people sat in their seats, their clothes shining under the glow, their faces curious but also doubtful. The boy's clothes were simple, nothing like the fancy jackets and dresses the other performers wore. His shirt was plain, his pants a little loose, and his hair looked like he had tried to brush it but still couldn't make it neat. He looked very young, too young to be standing there among grown musicians. The audience started whispering, some covering their mouths as they laughed softly. One older man near the front leaned to his friend and said, "This is going to be a waste of time." His friend chuckled and nodded. The boy heard the whispers, but he kept walking toward the piano in the center of the stage. His steps were slow, careful, as if the floor itself might break under his weight. The grand piano was huge compared to him. Its black surface shone under the stage lights. Its keys seemed endless. Stretching out in front of him like something from another world, the boy stopped and stared at it. His heart was racing so fast he could hear it in his ears. He felt a lump in his throat, and his small hands trembled as he reached up to pull out the piano bench. It was heavier than he thought, and a few people in the crowd laughed again as they watched him struggle to move it. One woman whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Does he even know how to sit properly on it?" Laughter spread in the rows behind her. The boy heard, and his cheeks turned red for a moment. He almost wanted to run back to escape the laughter, but then he remembered why he was there. He had practiced for years in secret, on an old broken piano in the corner of a dusty room. He had no teacher, no rich parents to guide him, only his ears and his heart, and now, this was his chance to prove he was not just a child to be mocked. He sat down slowly, his legs dangling just a little because the bench was too tall for him. The piano keys waited in front of him, silent but powerful. He glanced at the judges sitting behind their long table. Their faces were cold, their eyes sharp as if ready to strike down any mistake. One judge leaned back and crossed his arms, his mouth twitching into a small smile that was not kind but mocking. The boy looked back at the keys, trying to shut out the noise, the whispers and the heavy stares. He placed his hands on his knees first, trying to calm himself. The room was so quiet he could hear someone cough in the back row. He knew the audience expected him to fail. He could feel it in their eyes, in their laughter, in the way they leaned toward each other and whispered. They thought he was too young, too small, too unskilled. His hands moved slowly toward the piano and the hall tensed, but then, just as his fingers touched the edge of the cool ivory keys, someone in the crowd let out a loud laugh. "He looks like he doesn't even know which key to press," a man shouted. The crowd roared with laughter this time, and the sound hit the boy like a wave. His chest tightened, his vision blurred for a second. He thought he might cry, but deep inside something stronger pushed against the fear. He remembered his mother's words when she had hugged him before the contest. She had said, "They may laugh at you, but when you play, let them hear your heart." Those words rang in his head like a bell. He sat straighter on the bench, his small back firm. His eyes locked on the keys. He would not run. He would not let their laughter drown him. The audience grew restless, waiting for him to either play or embarrass himself. The judges leaned forward, some already ready to mark him low. But the boy breathed in slowly, holding that breath as if it was his shield. His hands lifted, and his fingers hovered above the white keys. His eyes closed, shutting out everything, shutting out everyone. It was just him and the piano now, nothing else. The whispers softened as people leaned forward again, curious. Some still smirked, ready to laugh once more. But something about the boy's face, the way his small fingers hovered in the air with such seriousness, made a few pause. The hall grew quieter, waiting, judging, doubting, and there he was. A tiny figure before a giant piano. A child before a sea of doubt. His heart raced, his breath trembled, but he was ready. Ready to show them that laughter would soon turn to silence. Ready to let his music speak where his voice could not. The moment hung in the air like the edge of a storm, and as his fingers pressed down on the very first note, everything changed. The first note was still echoing in the hall when the laughter came again. It was softer now, but it was there. A group of young men in the back row leaned toward each other. Shaking their heads, one of them whispered too loudly, "Maybe the kid just pressed a random key." His friends chuckled. The boy kept his eyes closed, trying not to hear them, trying not to feel the sting of their words before he could play another note. A voice cut through the hall. It was deep and mocking, A man sitting in the second row leaned back in his chair and said loudly, "Does he even know what a piano is?" His tone carried across the room like a whip. People near him laughed, even some who had stayed quiet before. The sound rose and bounced off the high walls of the music hall. Filling the boy's ears, his hands froze above the keys, his small shoulders tensed. His heart beat so hard it felt like it might break his chest open. He wanted to play, but every laugh stabbed into his confidence. He thought of standing up and walking away. He thought of saving himself from the humiliation. The thought was strong, pressing into his mind like a shadow that grew darker with every second. The judges did nothing to stop the laughter. They only watched, some with raised eyebrows, some with amused expressions. One judge leaned closer to another and whispered something that made the corner of her lips curl into a smile. The boy saw it, and it stung more than the laughter itself. These were the people who would decide his fate, and they already seemed sure of his failure. The boy's eyes opened. His vision was blurry from the tears he was holding back. He looked down at the keys, and for a moment, they seemed like strangers to him. He had spent so many nights with them, so many hours, learning, practicing, playing until his fingers hurt. Yet now they felt cold, unfamiliar, almost threatening. He pressed a few notes, soft, unsure. The sound came out weak, like the voice of someone afraid to speak. More laughter followed. A woman near the front whispered to her companion, "He looks like a lost child." The boy heard it, and his chest tightened again. But then he remembered something. It was not just his mother's words this time, but the long nights when he had been alone in that broken room. His small fingers had touched keys that didn't always work, yet he had still found music there. He had made songs out of silence. He had taught himself when no one believed in him. That memory brought a flicker of warmth to his heart. He took a slow breath and lifted his head. His eyes scanned the crowd. He saw the mocking faces, the amused judges, the restless audience. But he also saw a few faces that were different. A little girl sitting with her parents looked at him with wide eyes, not laughing, but waiting. An old man in the corner leaned forward. Curious, his face held no smile, only quiet interest. That gave the boy something to hold on to. He closed his eyes again, this time. When he placed his fingers on the keys, they didn't tremble as much. He pressed another note, stronger, clearer. It echoed across the hall, cutting through the whispers. He pressed another and then another. Each sound was steadier than the last. The laughter began to fade, not completely, but enough that the hall grew quieter. Some leaned back in their seats, their smiles slipping just a little. Something about the sound of those notes, even if they were simple, carried a weight they did not expect still. The mocking man in the second row leaned forward again, shaking his head. "He's just lucky," he muttered, loud enough for people nearby to hear. The boy heard it too, but this time he did not stop. His fingers moved again, slowly at first, like a child testing shallow water. Then with more confidence, as if he was stepping deeper. His small body swayed with the sound, his head tilting as he let the music guide him. The judges shifted in their seats. Some narrowed their eyes, no longer smiling but watching closely. One of them picked up a pen, ready to write something. Not mocking now, but careful. The boy did not see this, but he felt the change in the air. The hall was no longer only filled with laughter. It was filled with something else, expectation. The boy's heart still pounded, but it was no longer only fear. It was something stronger. Like fire spreading in his chest, his hands moved faster, shaping the first lines of the song he had carried with him for years. It was the song he had made alone in the dark, the one he had whispered to himself when he felt forgotten. It was his voice, his truth, his answer to all the mocking. The laughter was not gone, but it was weaker now. It did not shake him like before. Instead, it pushed him. It made him want to play louder, clearer, to show them who he was. His fingers struck the keys with more force, and the notes filled the hall like a wave rolling in from the sea. The mocking man leaned back in his seat, his smile fading. The whispers softened, and people leaned forward. Their faces were no longer filled with easy laughter, but with curiosity. The boy felt it. He felt the shift. The crowd was beginning to listen. And for the first time since he stepped onto the stage, the boy allowed himself a small, hidden smile. He knew he had survived the mockery. Now it was time to truly begin. The hall was still filled with murmurs when the boy pressed down on the keys again. This time the sound that came out was not weak or shaky. It was strong, deep, and alive. The first note hung in the air, clear like a bell in the silence of dawn. Then another followed, smooth and steady. Each note seemed to carry a piece of his heart. The audience that had mocked him only moments before now leaned forward, their laughter fading into quiet curiosity. The boy closed his eyes. His small fingers moved with care, as if the piano was not just an instrument but an old friend who understood him. The keys responded to his touch like they had been waiting for him all along. The notes blended together, rising and falling like waves on a restless sea. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed, and he allowed the music to flow out of him. It was no longer about proving himself to the crowd. It was about speaking in the only language he truly knew: music. The judges shifted in their seats. One who had been ready to give him the lowest score put down his pen and stared. Another who had smirked earlier tilted her head, surprised by the richness of the sound. The audience grew quieter with each passing moment. Even the man who had mocked him loudly was now silent, his smirk still on his lips but weaker. Unsure, the boy did not look at any of them. His world had shrunk to the piano in front of him. His soul and the instrument were one. The melody began softly like a whisper. It was delicate, fragile, almost like the sound of a lullaby sung to a lonely child. Some people in the audience tilted their heads, remembering something from long ago, a mother's voice, a memory of childhood. The song stirred feelings they didn't expect. Then, without warning, the music grew louder, fuller. It swelled like a storm breaking across the sky. The boy's fingers danced quickly over the keys. Faster and faster, the hall filled with sound. It was no longer a performance, it was a storm of emotions released. The boy leaned into the piano, his small body moving with the rhythm. His eyes remained closed, his face was calm, almost peaceful. But his hands told another story. They moved with intensity, striking the keys with strength beyond his size. The music was not polished or perfect like a trained master's, but it was raw, full of life. It carried something that could not be learned in books or classrooms. It was honest, and honesty has its own power. The people in the back row who had laughed the hardest were now silent. Their smiles had disappeared, replaced by wide eyes. The mocking man in the second row shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His arms were crossed, but his foot tapped softly without him realizing. The music had reached him, even if he would not admit it. The boy's song climbed higher, each note brighter, sharper. His fingers flew so quickly they were almost a blur, yet every sound was clear, controlled. It was as if the piano had come alive, breathing with him, crying with him, whispering his secrets to the crowd. The silence in the hall grew heavier, not empty but full of emotions that people could not explain. Some felt joy, others felt sadness, many felt both at once. The boy's music carried the pain of nights spent alone, the hope of dreams unspoken, and the courage to keep going even when the world laughed. An old man in the audience felt tears prick his eyes. He had once been a musician himself, long ago, before life forced him to leave it behind. Listening to the boy, he felt a piece of himself return. A woman clutched her chest, remembering the lullabies she used to sing to her baby, who was now grown. The judges leaned closer, forgetting their pens, forgetting the rules. Their eyes were fixed on the child who played as if he had lived 100 lives. The boy's heart raced, but it was no longer from fear. It was from release. The music was not something he was performing. It was something he was giving, something he was sharing. Every note was a story, every chord a cry. And though his eyes were shut, he could feel the room change. He could feel their attention, their silence, their surrender. The melody softened again, dipping low, almost like a secret being whispered. People leaned in without realizing, afraid to miss even a single sound. The hall that had once roared with laughter now held its breath. No one dared to speak, no one dared to laugh. All eyes were on the boy, all hearts caught in his song. He pressed the last key of the passage, and the note rang long and sweet. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not the silence of mockery anymore. It was the silence of awe, of disbelief, of hearts that had been touched deeply. The boy kept his eyes closed for a moment longer. His fingers still resting on the keys, his chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. And then, as he opened his eyes slowly, he saw the crowd differently. They were no longer laughing, they were no longer mocking. They were staring, wide-eyed, as if they had just seen something they could never forget. The boy sat a little taller, his lips pressed together. But inside he felt something new. He had not only survived, he had changed the room. And in that moment everyone knew. This was no ordinary child pressing random keys. This was someone who carried music in his soul. someone who had just begun to reveal it. The boy's fingers moved faster, and the sound that poured out of the piano grew stronger. It was no longer just music, it was something alive. It rose and fell like the wind before a storm. Soft at first, then wild and powerful. His small body swayed with every note. His head tilted forward, his eyes closed tight. He looked like he had left the stage behind and stepped into another world. The crowd that had once laughed sat frozen. Their eyes followed his every movement. Some leaned forward in their seats, afraid to even blink in case they missed something. The boy's music carried them to places they had not visited in years. Some heard echoes of their childhood. Some felt the ache of old heartbreaks. Others felt a hope they thought they had lost. The boy himself was no longer nervous. The fear that had once locked his chest was gone. In its place burned a fire that only grew brighter with each note. He pressed harder on the keys, his hands racing across the piano with surprising strength for someone so small. The sound grew louder, filling every corner of the hall. Each note struck like a heartbeat, and together they formed a storm that wrapped around everyone listening. The judges sat still, their pens forgotten. One of them, a stern-looking man with silver hair, blinked rapidly as though trying to hide the emotion rising inside him. Another judge pressed her hand against her lips, her eyes glistening. They had expected a child's clumsy attempt, but what they were hearing was deeper than years of practice. It was raw, honest, and filled with pain and beauty at once. The boy remembered lonely nights when he had played in the darkness, when no one clapped for him, when no one cared. He had poured his sadness into the old, broken piano at home. Now all of that was coming out. Every memory, every tear, every hope he had held in his small heart. The music rose and crashed like thunder, and the audience felt the weight of it. Some wiped their eyes quickly, not wanting others to see. His hands moved like lightning, striking the black and white keys with force. Yet every sound was clear. The melody twisted and turned, sometimes gentle like the brush of wind, sometimes sharp like the crack of lightning. His body shook with the effort, but he didn't stop. The fire inside him pushed him forward. The music was not just a performance. It was a storm from his soul. In the back row, a man who had laughed earlier sat with his arms crossed tightly. His foot tapped against the floor without him realizing. His face was stiff, but his eyes betrayed him. They followed the boy's hands, unable to look away. Near him, a woman pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. She had come expecting to be entertained, but she had not expected her heart to ache. The storm grew stronger, the notes rose higher. Swirling through the hall, the boy's chest lifted with every breath. His face showed no fear now, only focus. He looked as though he belonged there, not as a child among grown musicians, but as someone the piano itself had chosen. The audience no longer saw a small boy in plain clothes. They saw a soul that carried storms inside him. One judge leaned forward, whispering to himself, "Impossible." His hands trembled as he tried to understand how a child could play like this. He had spent years studying, teaching, and performing. Yet the music before him was something else. It was not about skill, it was about truth. And truth is harder to learn than technique. The boy's fingers slid into softer notes. The storm calmed, turning into gentle rain. The sound touched hearts in a new way. Some people closed their eyes, breathing slowly, letting the music wash over them. The same audience that had mocked him now sat in silence. Every laugh had died, every whisper was gone. All that remained was the boy and his music. He thought of his mother, of the way she used to hum when she cooked. He thought of the hunger they often faced, the cold nights, the way he would press his little hands against the piano keys just to feel less alone. These memories filled his playing, giving the music a depth beyond his years. It was not a song he had learned, it was a song he had lived. The storm returned for a moment, a burst of sound that shook the hall. His small frame looked fragile against the mighty instrument, but his spirit was stronger than steel. The keys answered him, roaring with him, crying with him together. Boy and piano created something unforgettable. When the passage ended, the music slowed. The boy's hands rested gently on the keys, his chest heaving. The last note rang out. Fading into silence, the storm was over, but its memory lingered in every heart in the hall. No one clapped yet, no one moved. They were still caught inside the world he had built with his song. The boy opened his eyes slowly. His cheeks were flushed. Sweat glistened on his forehead, but his gaze was steady. He looked out at the crowd, and for the first time he saw no laughter, no mockery. He saw faces softened with awe, with tears, with something close to respect. He had played not just a song, but his soul. He had taken the pain, the loneliness, and the hope inside him and turned it into a storm that no one could ignore. And in that hall, filled with silence and stunned faces, the boy knew he had made them listen, he had made them feel, and the storm inside him had found its voice. The boy's fingers moved into softer notes, and the storm he had created began to settle. The music became gentle, tender, like the soft patter of rain after thunder has passed. It was as if the piano itself was sighing, letting out secrets it had kept for years. The crowd sat still, their faces touched with emotions they did not expect to feel. People who had laughed at him before now leaned forward, their eyes wide, their hearts trembling. A mother in the audience felt tears run down her cheeks. The melody reminded her of the nights when her baby was small and would not sleep. She remembered holding him in her arms, rocking him, humming softly in the dark. The boy's music carried that same softness, that same love. It was a lullaby for every heart in the room. Another man, older and gray, felt his chest tighten. Long ago, he had fallen in love with a girl he could never forget. When the boy's fingers danced across the keys, he saw her face in his mind again. The way she had laughed, the way she had left. The music pulled the memory from the deepest corner of his heart, and he felt both joy and pain at once. The hall was no longer filled with whispers or mocking smiles, it was filled with silence. But not an empty silence, it was heavy, alive, full of feelings too big for words. Some people tried to look away, embarrassed by their own tears, but they could not escape the pull of the music. It held them tightly, refusing to let go. The boy's body swayed gently with the notes. His face was calm, his eyes closed, his fingers pressed with care, as if he was touching something fragile. Every sound that came from the piano carried warmth and sorrow together. It was a story of struggle, of loneliness, of dreams too heavy for such a small boy to carry, and yet it was also a story of hope. The judges had forgotten themselves. One of them, a strict woman known for never showing emotion, had her hand pressed against her chest. She blinked quickly, but a tear slipped free anyway. Another judge, who had rolled his eyes at the start, now leaned forward, both elbows on the table, his face pale. He whispered to himself, "How can this be?" The mocking man in the second row, who had been so loud earlier, now sat with his head lowered. His arms were no longer crossed, his eyes darted around the room, but he did not dare to meet anyone else's gaze. For the first time that evening, he had no words, he could not laugh, not now. The boy's music had reached even him. Though he tried hard to hide it, the boy played on, his heart guiding his hands. He was no longer a child on a stage trying to prove himself. He was a storyteller, and the piano was his voice. He told them about nights spent hungry, about sitting beside a broken window where the wind howled. He told them about wishing for something more, about carrying hope in the darkest hours. He told them about love he had never known but dreamed of anyway. Each note struck deeper than words ever could. People shifted in their seats, not from boredom but from the weight of what they felt. A man who had lost his wife years ago pressed his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, they were wet. A young woman gripped the armrest of her chair tightly, her chest rising and falling as if the music had touched something inside her she did not want to remember. The boy did not know their stories. He did not see their tears. He only played, but his soul was speaking directly to theirs. The connection was invisible but unbreakable. The laughter that had once filled the hall was long gone, replaced by something stronger. The melody rose again, not with anger this time, but with strength. It lifted gently, pulling every heart with it. The boy's small shoulders straightened as though he was no longer carrying fear. He looked taller, older, like someone who had lived through storms and found his way out. The piano keys sang for him and the hall listened. The last part of the passage was soft, almost like a farewell. His fingers slowed, pressing each note as though he wanted to give it all his love before letting it go. The sound drifted across the room like a whisper, tender and heartbreaking, and when the final note lingered in the air, it felt like time itself had stopped. No one moved, no one clapped. The audience sat frozen, caught in the spell of what they had just heard. It was not a performance anymore. It was a confession, a prayer, a cry, and a gift. The boy's music had broken through every wall of doubt. Every mocking smile had been replaced by awe. Every heart had been shaken. The boy opened his eyes slowly. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He looked at the piano, his hand still resting on the keys. His face was calm but tired, as though he had given everything he had. He turned his head slightly and glanced at the crowd. For the first time he saw not laughter, not mockery, but silence filled with respect. People looked at him differently now. They no longer saw a child in plain clothes. They saw a boy whose music carried the power to make strangers weep. They saw someone small who had touched something great. In that silence, hearts broke and healed at the same time. And without a single word, the boy had reminded them of something they had forgotten. That music was not about skill alone, it was about the soul. And his soul had spoken louder than anything else that night. The hall was heavy with silence, but it was not the silence of boredom. It was the silence of people who had forgotten where they were. They were lost in the boy's music. His small fingers kept moving across the keys, and each note carried a new story. The storm had passed, the lullaby had faded, but now something even greater began to rise. It was no longer just a song. It was something that felt bigger than the boy himself. The judges leaned forward in their seats. Their eyes were fixed on him. The strict woman who never showed emotion wiped another tear, though she tried to hide it. The silver-haired judge shook his head slowly, whispering, "Impossible. This can't be real." He had seen hundreds of students, hundreds of performers, but never had he seen a child play with such truth. The boy's hands did not stop. His fingers moved with both speed and grace, striking the keys with perfect timing. It was not only skill, it was something deeper. Every note had meaning, every sound carried emotion. It was as if the piano itself had been waiting for him all these years, waiting for his touch, waiting for his story to come alive through its keys. The audience was stunned. Their earlier laughter was now a memory they wished they could erase. No one dared to whisper, no one dared to cough. Their hearts were captured, chained by the music that filled the hall. People felt tears rising again, and this time they did not fight them. Some wiped their eyes openly. Others let the tears fall without shame. One man in the front row leaned to his wife and whispered, "He plays like he has lived 1,000 lives." His wife only nodded, unable to speak, for she felt the same. This was not the playing of a child who had learned scales. This was the voice of a soul that had carried both sorrow and hope. The mocking man in the second row sat stiff in his seat, his face pale now. The smirk that had once stretched across his lips was gone. He no longer laughed, he no longer mocked. His eyes were locked on the boy's hands, and his heart, though he would never admit it, was trembling. The music had broken through the wall of pride he had built around himself. The boy's song grew higher, brighter. His fingers moved faster than ever, but each note was clear, controlled, and beautiful. It was as if he and the piano were no longer separate. They were one, breathing together, speaking together. The boy was no longer a child on a stage. He was a master, even if no one had taught him. The judges whispered to each other, their voices shaky. "He plays with emotion we cannot teach," one of them said. "This is beyond skill," another added. They were not just shocked, they were humbled. They had spent years learning techniques, perfecting styles. Yet this boy played with something they could never write down in notes. The crowd could feel it too. Their bodies leaned forward, their breath slow. Each sound reached deep inside them, stirring memories they had hidden, fears they had buried, hopes they had forgotten. The music was not just in their ears. It was in their hearts. The boy pressed harder, and the piano roared like thunder again. The hall shook with the force of his song. Then he slowed, letting the notes fall gently like drops of rain. People shivered as the sudden change washed over them. The music was alive, unpredictable. It was like watching the sky turn from storm to calm within seconds. An old musician in the crowd whispered to himself, "This is not practice, this is gift." He knew talent when he saw it, and he knew this was something rare, the kind of gift that only comes once in a generation, the kind of gift that makes the world stop and listen. The boy's body moved with the rhythm, his head tilted back, his lips parted slightly as if he were breathing the music itself. He did not look like a boy anymore. He looked like a messenger, someone carrying something far beyond himself. The audience was powerless. They had no choice but to listen. Every beat of the piano struck their hearts, and they felt smaller before the greatness of the sound. Even those who had no love for music, even those who had never cared for piano, sat stunned. They knew they were witnessing something they would never forget. The mocking man finally dropped his head into his hands. He could not bear to look at the boy anymore, not because the music was bad, but because it was too powerful, it stripped away his pride. It reminded him of his own failures, of dreams he had buried long ago. The boy's song had reached him in a place he thought was long dead. The judges looked at one another and one whispered, "He will change everything." Another nodded. This is history. They were no longer thinking about scores or prizes. They were thinking about the world, about how this small child was about to shake it. The boy ended the passage with a crashing chord, his fingers pressing with all the strength he had. The sound exploded in the hall, then faded slowly into a silence so heavy it almost hurt. The crowd did not move. They sat frozen, their hearts still inside the song. The boy opened his eyes, sweat shining on his forehead. His chest rose and fell. He looked tired but not broken. His gaze drifted across the room and he saw it. Faces filled with awe. With tears, with respect, not one smile of mockery remained. The boy had not only silenced them, he had humbled them. He had shown them something greater than skill. He had shown them the storm inside his soul. And now even the masters, the judges, the proud men and women, had no choice but to admit the truth. This child was not ordinary. This child was a miracle. The boy's song reached its highest point. His fingers flew over the keys so quickly that the audience could hardly believe what they were seeing. Each note was like a burst of light. Clear, powerful, and filled with meaning. The music climbed higher and higher, pulling everyone with it. It felt as if the walls of the hall could barely contain the sound, as if the piano itself would break from the force. The audience was lost. They had forgotten their laughter, forgotten their doubts. They were carried on the storm of his music. Every heart beat faster with every note. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide, their mouths open. The judges gripped the edges of the table, staring as though afraid to miss even a second. The boy's small body shook with the effort. His arms moved with strength no one expected from him. His back was straight, his head tilted slightly. His face calm but focused. His eyes stayed closed as if the music itself was guiding him. The sound was no longer just music. It was a force, a wave crashing through the hall. People in the crowd began to cry openly. A young woman wiped her eyes again and again, unable to stop the tears. An old man covered his mouth with his hand, afraid of the sob that tried to escape. Even children in the audience sat quiet, their small faces serious as if they too understood the weight of what they were hearing. The mocking man in the second row had his hands pressed against his knees, his eyes wide and unblinking. His lips moved slightly as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. He looked broken, not by shame this time, but by awe. He could not deny it anymore. This boy was not just playing. He was creating something greater than himself. The judges exchanged glances. They did not smile, they did not speak. They looked at each other with eyes full of wonder and disbelief. One whispered under his breath, "This is not talent. This is destiny." Another nodded, unable to find words. For years they had judged performers, but never had they felt like this. Never had they seen music turn into something so powerful. The boy's fingers pressed harder, his song roaring like thunder. Then suddenly he slowed. His hands moved with delicate grace. The notes became soft again, almost fragile. It was as if he was saying goodbye, as if he was letting the music itself rest. The audience leaned in, every ear desperate not to miss even a single sound. And then came the final note. The boy pressed it slowly, holding it with all the strength in his small body. The sound rang out pure and long. It filled the hall. It lingered in the air. It seemed to touch every corner, every wall, every person's heart. The note stretched until it could go no longer. And then it faded. The hall fell into silence. A silence so heavy that it felt alive. No one moved, no one clapped. It was as if time itself had stopped. The boy's hands rested gently on the keys, his chest rising and falling, his eyes opened slowly, and he looked out at the crowd. For a moment there was nothing, only silence, and then it came. First a single clap, then another, and then suddenly the entire hall erupted into sound. The applause was thunderous, rolling through the hall like an earthquake. People stood from their seats, cheering, crying, clapping until their hands hurt. The sound was louder than any laughter had been. Louder than any doubt. The boy sat still for a second, his eyes wide. His lips trembled as he tried to take in what was happening. Tears filled his eyes, but this time they were not from fear or pain. They were from relief, from joy, from the knowledge that he had finally been heard. The judges rose from their seats, something they rarely did. They clapped too, their faces open with respect. One judge even bowed his head slightly, humbled by what he had witnessed. Another wiped her eyes, smiling through her tears. They were no longer judges in that moment. They were simply people who had been moved. The mocking man in the second row was on his feet as well. His face pale, his eyes wet, he clapped harder than anyone else. Trying to hide his shame in the noise, he could no longer deny the truth. The boy he had laughed at, the boy he had mocked, had just broken his pride and touched his soul. The hall shook with applause, but the boy sat quietly. His tears fell onto his cheeks as he bowed his head. He had given them everything, every piece of his heart, and now they gave him their respect. It was overwhelming, but it was real. The crowd cheered his name. They shouted, they whistled, they wanted more. But the boy only smiled through his tears. He had played all he had to give, and it was enough. He had made the world kneel, not through force, not through anger, but through the honesty of his music. The final note still echoed in their hearts. It would stay with them long after the boy left the stage. It would follow them home, whisper to them in their dreams. It was more than a note, it was a memory, a gift, something they would never forget. And as the cheers filled the air, the boy looked up, his face shining with tears and light. He had walked onto that stage as a child to be mocked, but he had left it as something greater, a name that would be remembered forever. The hall was still shaking with applause when the boy stood up from the piano bench. His legs trembled, but not from fear this time. They trembled from the weight of what had just happened. The crowd was on their feet, clapping, shouting, cheering his name. The sound was so loud that he could feel it in his chest. The boy lowered his head and bowed, his tears falling freely now. He had not expected this. He had only wanted to play, to show the music inside him. Yet in that moment he had done something far greater. People rushed to the front of the stage, reaching out as if they wanted to touch him. To thank him, some shouted, "Bravo!" Others simply cried as they clapped. The judges stood too, their faces full of respect. One judge, the silver-haired man, pressed his hands together and bowed deeply toward the boy. It was something he had never done for any performer before. The boy blinked in surprise, unsure how to react. The mocking man in the second row was no longer mocking. His face was pale, his eyes wet. He clapped harder than anyone else, though he could not bring himself to look at the boy directly. Inside, he felt small and ashamed. He had laughed at greatness before it had revealed itself, and now he could only bow his head and admit he had been wrong. The boy left the stage slowly, still unsure if this was real. Backstage, people surrounded him, musicians, organizers, even strangers reached out to shake his hand. Some told him they had never heard anything like it. Others whispered that he had changed the way they would think about music forever. The boy only nodded shyly, his face red with emotion. He did not know what to say. Words were never his gift. His gift had always been his music. The next day, the story of the boy spread. Newspapers wrote about the child who had silenced a hall of doubters. Journalists called him a prodigy. Some said he was the future of music. Others said he was a miracle. Videos of his performance spread quickly. People who had not been there watched in awe as they listened to his song. Millions around the world felt what the audience had felt that night. In small homes, families gathered around screens to watch. Some cried, some smiled, all felt the same awe. Musicians shared his story, saying they had never seen such raw talent. Famous pianists admitted that even they could not play with the same emotion. They said technique could be taught, but what this boy had could not be learned. It was born from his soul. The boy, however, did not think of himself as special. When he returned home, he went back to his old piano, the one with broken keys and scratches on the wood. He sat down and played softly. His mother stood by the door, her eyes full of pride and tears. She had always believed in him, even when the world laughed. Now the world believed too. Letters began to arrive. Some from music schools offering him scholarships. Some from strangers thanking him for touching their hearts. People wrote about how his music had reminded them of love, of loss, of dreams. Some said they had felt hope for the first time in years after hearing him play. The boy read the letters with wide eyes, amazed that his music could reach so many. The judges who had watched him that night told their colleagues, "We witnessed history." They could not stop talking about the boy. Some even admitted that his performance had changed the way they would judge forever. They would never again look at a performer and laugh before hearing them. They had learned that greatness could come from anywhere. Even from a child in simple clothes, the boy's name spread from city to city. From country to country, it was whispered in schools, spoken in music halls, praised in magazines. He was no longer just a boy, he was a symbol. A reminder that talent and truth cannot be hidden forever. The world had tried to laugh at him, but in the end they had bowed years later. People still spoke of that night. They remembered how a small child had walked onto a stage and faced laughter. They remembered how he had closed his eyes, touched the keys and changed everything. They remembered the storm, the lullaby, the final note that had hung in the air like a gift from heaven. The boy himself never forgot it either. He remembered the laughter, yes, but he remembered something greater. He remembered the silence that followed his song. The silence filled with awe. He remembered the faces that had been touched, the tears, the respect. He carried those memories with him every time he sat at a piano. And so, the boy who once was mocked became a name the world would never forget. His music was not only sound, it was truth. His truth. And that truth had made even the proudest, even the hardest hearts kneel. He had walked onto the stage as a child no one believed in. He had walked off it as something more. He had walked off it as a legend,